When Cameron presented me with the divorce settlement for the 19th time, I agreed. The girl who held his heart was clamoring for recognition and couldn't wait any longer. Neither could I. I was pregnant, and the child wasn't his. After signing the agreement, I immediately snapped a photo and sent it to Cameron. All signed. Should I have your assistant come collect it? 20 minutes passed quietly. Cameron's chat window was as silent as death. I was considering whether to arrange a same-day courier when Cameron appeared breathless at the doorway. He actually came in person. No wonder. His little mistress had been stirring up a scandal for half a year, demanding recognition. It looked like he was genuinely frantic. Go on. What scheme are you pulling now? Everything you're entitled to has been given, he said coldly, his voice edged with impatience. 3 years ago, Cameron Mal married me in a wedding ceremony. Since then, I've remained his nominal Mrs. Mao in name only. I was there with him, from rags to riches. But for the past 6 months, he'd been scheming to dump me, just to make room for his little canary. The property division agreement had already gone through the 19th version. Before, I wasn't satisfied. But this time, I signed it without a word, and yet he seemed suspicious. I gave a faint smile and handed him the signed agreement. He opened it with doubt, and when he saw that I'd actually signed, his face darkened. Misty, you really agree to this? I gave him a puzzled look. He used to say he couldn't stand my immaturity and the way I'd get jealous over nothing. Now I wasn't fighting or making a scene. I'd agreed to take the money and leave as he wanted, yet he seemed even more displeased. He didn't expect me to cry and beg him to stay, did he? I smiled. Isn't this better? You can publicly marry Elena now, and I'll finally get to rebuild my life. This time, the agreement included everything: houses, cars, company shares. He'd truly gone all out. I took it all without hesitation. After all, I was the one who had been with him through all those years when we were just ordinary people, who would truly be content to plant a tree only for others to enjoy its shade. Well, now it's settled. With the wealth I've accumulated over these years combined with a settlement, even if I start traveling the world tomorrow, it's enough to sustain a luxurious life for the rest of my days. Love may be gone, but at least I still have a lot of money. Cameron listened to me, but his gaze was complicated, as if he wanted to say something but held back. Just then, a soft, coquettish voice interrupted us. Thank you for stepping aside, Misty. Elena, the little canary Cameron kept on his heart. She was a golden phoenix, soaring from a remote mountain hollow, holding a degree from a second-tier college. It was impressive enough that she got into the competitive Mao group, but she even managed to become Cameron's executive assistant in just 3 months. She really worked hard at seducing Cameron. Cameron would always go on about how pure and kind-hearted she was, constantly fearing I'd mistreat her. But what pure and kind-hearted person would sleep with a married man and send those bed photos to his wife? I used to be unable to let go, crying and throwing tantrums. Once, in a fit of rage, I exposed them online. The next day, there was no trace left. Cameron was always decisive. The irony is that he would eventually employ the same tactics against me. After all this, I was already tired of it. I gazed at the two of them with a wry smile, not another word to spare. Got the agreement. Still not leaving? I gave them the cold shoulder. This villa was in my name. After Cameron started seeing his mistresses more often, he rarely came back here. The longer they stayed there, the more I felt the urge to disinfect the whole house. Cameron's face darkened. Misty, playing hard to get won't work on me. Since you dared to sign this, don't you dare regret it. With that, he grabbed Elena and headed toward the door. Wait, I called out to Cameron. He turned back, wearing the expression of someone who expected this. He probably thought I wasn't over him, but I was only reminding him, don't forget the money transfer and make sure the property is transferred to my name as soon as possible. His expression froze for a second. Then he said through gritted teeth, You're really in a hurry. Of course I was in a hurry. I was pregnant, and the baby wasn't his. If I didn't sever ties with him now, it wouldn't end well. I had scheduled a prenatal checkup, but never expected to encounter Cameron and Elena at the hospital. He was holding her hand carefully. Elena was chatting away, and he listened patiently, his gaze warm and affectionate. They were so close, it felt like no one could squeeze between them. Memories flooded back. Long ago, he had treasured me. But that was a long time ago. The last time he looked at me like that was when I had a miscarriage. I was 4 months pregnant at the time. He had already taken his first mistress by then. She was a fearless girl. She stormed in, demanding that I make room for her. I called her shameless, but she said only the unloved were the mistress. Perhaps her pride was severely wounded, for she shoved me violently. And just like that, we lost the child. I was covered in blood and rushed into the operating room. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was Cameron's face full of guilt. His eyes filled with guilt. He clutched my hand desperately, choking back sobs. "I'm sorry, Misty. I'm the bastard. Hit me if you want. I'm sorry." I slapped him hard, but he didn't even try to dodge. He just took it. After I was tired of hitting him, he spoke, voice hoarse. "Just this once, Misty. Give me a chance to make it up to you, okay? We'll have more children." He sent that girl away and reverted to being the considerate lover. Sadly, it lasted only half a year. Half a year later, another girl had appeared by his side. After that, the girls kept coming and going. Each face so young and delicate, I never had time to remember one before a new one appeared. Elena has been with him the longest. It was truly awkward running into them in the obstetrics and gynecology department. I immediately turned to leave. But Elena's voice stopped me. "Misty, what a coincidence." She was practically hanging off Cameron, looking bashful with her rosy cheeks. "I'm pregnant, here to see the doctor." I watched her perform expressionless. When Cameron saw the appointment slip in my hand, his brow furrowed. "What are you here for?" I smiled coldly. "Mr. Mao, you might want to avoid being too curious about your ex-wife's privacy in front of your new lover." He seemed a little agitated and actually shoved Elena aside, grabbing my wrist. "Misty, I'm your man. You suddenly show up in the OB/GYN department. I have the right to ask." I stared at him, my tone dripping with mockery. "My man? Mr. Mao, are you sure about that? Although we had a wedding. In the marriage registration system, I've always been unmarried." Cameron froze for a second, as if suddenly remembering something, his gaze darkening. Yes, that wedding was so romantic and grand. To outsiders, I was the only Mrs. Mao, especially with all the business dealings and shares we had intertwined over the years. But who knew? We had never actually gone to the Civil Affairs Bureau. Every time I urged Cameron to register the marriage, he'd either be in a meeting or going on an overseas business trip. His time was always far too precious. So precious that in 3 whole years, he couldn't even spare 30 minutes to register our marriage. And when it came to divorce, we tore at each other over money and power distribution, and everyone knew about it. My wrist hurt from his grip, but he wouldn't loosen his hold. Fortunately, not long after, the call light beeped. "Please, patient Misty, proceed to consultation room 5. Only then did Cameron reluctantly release my hand. I immediately brushed past him and Elena, entered the examination room, and locked the door securely behind me. I didn't acknowledge Cameron at all, his face having turned thunderously dark. After carefully reviewing my medical records, the doctor offered some instructions and told me to bring the baby's father along to my next appointment. "He's dead." The words struck like a thunderclap, and the doctor, who had been focused on writing the medical report, quickly looked up, his eyes filled with sympathy. He switched to a comforting tone, offering condolences and advising me to take care. I cooperated, showing a sorrowful expression. Maybe it was the early stages of pregnancy making me drowsy. After returning from the hospital, I fell into a deep slumber. In my drowsy state, I dreamt many dreams. At first, it was when I had just graduated from college, right when Cameron's family went bankrupt, and he ended up on the streets. We were crammed into a tiny rented room, and he held me close, wrapping me in his down jacket, his chest pressed against my heart. Misty, when I make money, I'll never let you suffer again. I'll hire at least 5 people. One to cook for you, one to do your laundry, one to make your bed. I could hear his vigorous heartbeat. His tender words flushed my cheeks crimson, and I naively clung to his promise that love would conquer all trials. Eventually, he did make a comeback and achieved fame and fortune. However, as his star rose, more and more people flocked to him. They drifted in and out, like Cameron's elusive love. The dream ended with a floor in disarray, shattered porcelain shards, blood staining the soles of my feet, and me collapsed in hysterical sobs. He watched impassively as I unraveled, offering only an empty remark. Misty, this is beneath you. In that moment, I looked at him, the person I had once loved so deeply. It felt like he had suddenly rotted away. When I woke up, twilight had fallen. Still groggy, I started to sit up, but a sudden voice startled me. I heard, "You're carrying my child, yet you're out there telling everyone I'm dead." I jolted awake and turned toward the voice. By the floor-to-ceiling window stood a man watching me, moonlight streaming through to plate his dark suit in liquid silver. The room was unlit, and he was hidden in the darkness. Had he not spoken, I might never have noticed him there. "David, are you trying to scare someone to death? You're going too far." David chuckled at my words. He walked over to the bed and pulled me into his arms. His warmth seeped through my thin nightgown, his hand gently rubbing my lower back. When he spoke again, his tone brimmed with helpless exasperation. "Who exactly is being unreasonable here, Misty? First you sleep with me and bolt. Now you want to flee with my child too?" David was right. My plan was to take the child and settle in a small town, far away from Cameron and David. After all, my start with him wasn't exactly honorable. It was 3 months ago on my birthday. Cameron took the initiative to say that before we separated, he wanted to spend one last birthday with me. For good luck, so we could part on good terms. He had already booked a restaurant, a table by the window where the night view could be seen in its entirety. He came to pick me up at home, as if nothing had ever changed between us. He brought me a cake, personally arranged the candles and lit them. "Make a wish," he urged. At his urging, I reluctantly closed my eyes, my mind in turmoil, and whispered inside, "My wish is..." It was only about 10 seconds. When I opened my eyes again, I stared blankly at the vacant space across from me. Cameron had disappeared without a trace. I waited for a while, but he never came back. Eventually, the waiter came to inform me, "Mr. Mao just received a phone call and left. He asked me to tell you to finish your meal and leave. He covered all the expenses for today." I stared at the cake, the candles having burned out and the frosting slowly sinking. The happy birthday lettering morphed into grotesque crimson blotches. Finally, I laughed sardonically. After leaving the restaurant, I took a cab to the harbor. Back when we were poor and couldn't afford to travel elsewhere, Cameron would always take me for walks around the harbor. He would say that even if we couldn't see new sights, it was still nice to feel the sea breeze. The sea remained the same, but the people had long since changed. I wandered aimlessly for a long time, until suddenly someone beside me gasped, "Oh my God, this is so romantic." I followed their gaze to the night sky above the sea, where the pitch-black expanse shimmered with countless drone lights, displaying the romantic cursive script, "Elena, I love you." Seconds later, fireworks burst across the sky. Gorgeous. Beautiful. Passers-by marveled. "Wow, which young master is confessing his love today?" Sigh. Another day stuck as a background NPC in this world. I opened WeChat Moments almost masochistically. As expected, I saw Elena's show-off post. "True love is when, no matter the time, if I just say I miss him, he'll stage a romantic confession for me." The picture was of the drone confession. When a person's heart dies completely, they become no different from a madman. I bought copious amounts of alcohol and drank them all. The harbor was swarming with people, and there stood Cameron and Elena, encircled by oblivious passers-by who remained completely unaware of me. Yet I kept watching them, my gaze lingering for what felt like an eternity. until I realized that my surroundings were filled with empty bottles and my vision was starting to blur. I realized it was dangerous to keep drinking, so I stumbled away. It took me a while to get out of the noisy harbor. As I walked along the street, I bumped into someone. "Be careful," he said, steadying me with his hand. I straightened up and finally saw who it was. David, the influential figure in Shanghai's elite circles and heir to the Coup Group conglomerate. Because of business investments, I had some dealings with him over the years. I could say that about 2/3 of my wealth was made possible by this tree I had grown under. He was the complete opposite of Cameron. There was hardly a woman around him. People in the circle often joked about him being gay, and he never denied it. "Misty." He steadied me, his brow furrowed. "How much have you had to drink?" His scent was pleasant and clean, unlike Cameron, who always carried the lingering fragrance of Elena's perfume. "David, they all say you like men. Is that true?" For some reason, I just blurted it out. My tongue was a little numb, probably from the alcohol. David was stunned for a moment, then sighed helplessly and carefully helped me into his Rolls-Royce. Maybe it was because he looked just the way I liked. Maybe the alcohol dulled my senses. Or maybe I just wanted to take revenge on Cameron in my own way. I quietly leaned in toward David, kissing him on the cheek. He turned his head, stunned, looking at me. In that moment, his pupils trembled. His pale skin flushed slightly with warmth. The next second, I boldly straddled him. "David, do you want to try it with me?" I was too close. My lips brushed his earlobe. It was so soft. I decided to kiss him. His earlobe warmed slightly. His voice sounded hoarse above me. "Misty, snap out of it." I laughed. "I'm completely sober. I know you men always prefer young beauties. Just mutter, 'I'm bored,' and you can cast any woman aside." The desire inside me surged, and I instinctively wanted to move closer to a cooler place. His brow furrowed, his gaze darkening. I tilted my head and went for another kiss. This time, he didn't dodge. His lips were cool, with a refreshing minty fragrance. They smelled divine. The kiss made me feel dizzy, almost suffocating. But he held the back of my head with one hand and my waist with the other, forcing me to continue. The partition in the car rose at precisely the right moment, sealing off the space completely into an enclosed compartment. Finally, he pulled away from me, his voice even hoarser. "Misty, I don't like men. And I don't like young girls." His reaction time was so slow. We'd already kissed. Why was he saying this? The alcohol didn't black me out, but my mind was certainly foggy. Before I could figure things out, David started the engine. Before long, we arrived at our destination. David carefully lifted me from the back seat. He carried me through the villa's living room, hurried upstairs to the bedroom, and carefully laid me on the bed. Standing by the bed, he gazed down at me from above. My eyes remained locked on his lips, still moist from the kiss, glistening faintly. They looked slightly swollen and flushed. My gaze lowered, and the buttons on his shirt were undone just enough to reveal his collarbone, exposed to the air. He looked like a seductive demon. He curved his lips into a subtle smile, guiding my hand beneath the hem of his shirt. "Misty, do you want this?" Yes. With my answer satisfying him, David closed in and kissed my lips. Unlike the previous 2 times, this kiss was deep and heavy. It felt like he was unleashing a strong desire for possession. The searing kisses trailed downward. "Misty, do you like this?" My face burned crimson, clinging to David like a lifeline. I initially resisted by biting my lip into silence. But in the end, I succumbed under David's relentless advance. I buried my face in his neck and murmured, "I like it." He kissed me contentedly. Eventually, I fell into a deep sleep in his arms. The next morning, when I woke up, he was already gone. I knew what this meant. He must be the type who avoids complications. And I, too, was the same. Since he was gone, I naturally had to pretend like nothing had happened. It would be better for both of us. So I slipped away, blocked all his contact information, and severed all ties cleanly to avoid awkwardness. As for business matters, I would let the people below handle it from now on, keeping it strictly professional. Since then, I hadn't seen David again. Until recently, when my period was late, I suddenly remembered. After that night, I never took the morning after pill. I secretly bought a pregnancy test kit. I took 5 tests consecutively, and every single one displayed 2 bold lines. I was completely confused. After my miscarriage, the doctor had told me that if I ever wanted to get pregnant again, it would be difficult. So, where's the supposed difficulty? How did David manage to get me pregnant on the first try? I was perplexed. By all rights, David had the right to know. But recalling his attitude that day, I couldn't quite gauge his intentions. Just in case, I didn't say anything and planned to quickly break up with Cameron and set a good future for myself and the baby. But unfortunately, before I could make my arrangements, David came to find me. "Misty, why did you block me?" His lips were close to my ear, his voice cold, but the warm breath from his lips lingered. "You're not regretting after sleeping with me, are you?" His attitude had me dumbfounded. I hadn't expected him to be this upset about me blocking him. To avoid more misunderstandings, I decided to clarify. "David, we're both adults." That night, I made the first move, so I took responsibility for whatever happened after. "You found the hospital records, so you must know. I'm definitely keeping the baby. I have money, and I can take care of raising the child myself, so it won't trouble you. If you're really worried, we can sign a confidentiality agreement." David, who had been kissing my earlobe, suddenly froze, his voice dropping even lower. "You'll handle this alone? What if the child asks about his father? What if he wants to see his father's picture?" I had thought about this carefully. "I'll tell the child that his father passed away. The photos can be AI generated, and as for the cause of death, I'll say it was a car accident. If you're not happy with that, you can come up with a more dignified way for your death. Of course, if you want to see the kid later, that's fine. He can just call you uncle." David frowned at first, but by the time he finished listening, he burst out laughing. "Call me uncle? Misty, what exactly do you think I am?" I choked on my words, unsure of his meaning. Why wasn't he satisfied when I had already thought everything through for him? "David, I just didn't want to trouble you too much. After all, you left so decisively that day." As I spoke, I observed David's expression, considering other possibilities. Could it be that now that he knew I was pregnant, he had changed his mind and wanted to fight me for custody? David took several deep breaths before finally speaking again, his voice full of helplessness. "I never thought of you as a burden." I froze for a moment. A strange, absurd thought started to form in my mind. David's gaze became very deep as he looked at me, and he explained seriously. "That day, there was a problem with a project at my French branch, and I had to go there personally to handle it. I left you a note asking you to wait for me to come back. So, you didn't see anything at all." A note? I definitely didn't see one. In this age of advanced technology, why would he leave a note? Besides, I was too mortified to even glance around properly. I just wanted to escape immediately, and certainly wasn't about to check the bedside for any note. David continued his complaints. "When I tried to contact you later, I found that you had blocked all my contact information. Misty, do you think I'm some kind of disgrace?" I gave an awkward laugh. "That's a bit too harsh. But we can't just sleep together and then wake up to get married, right?" He lowered his gaze and countered. "Why not?" My eyes suddenly widened in disbelief. "Are you really serious?" I exclaimed. "David, do you really like children that much?" David's gaze became even deeper, and he stared at me for a long time. His voice, with a hint of laziness, came out in a low tone. "Just think of it as me liking kids." Of course, I didn't accept David. That was ridiculous. Cameron and I had gone from mutual devotion to mutual aversion after years of entanglement, yet never achieved a proper closure. I refused to recklessly plunge into another marriage trap. David didn't force me, but insisted I re-add all his contacts. He also demanded I notify him for my next prenatal checkup. I frowned. Is that really necessary? Maybe it was just my impression, but there seemed to be a hint of teeth gritting in his smile as he responded. "You said I like kids, right?" Someone who likes kids could never let you go alone for a checkup.
Fine.
I respected his rights as the biological father. Besides, he was still the cash cow of my business. Some face-saving courtesy was still warranted. After that, David began paying close attention to my dietary needs and frequently purchased baby essentials. Once during a business trip to Europe, he personally brought back a custom-made crib crafted by a renowned artisan, the bed overflowing with diapers, infant formula, and baby skincare products. It seemed he was really looking forward to the baby's arrival. As time went on, I grew accustomed to it. It wasn't until half a month later at the auction that something unusual happened. When David and I entered, we ran into Cameron. Elena clung to Cameron's arm, her eyes brimming with unconcealed smugness. It had been a while since our last encounter, and Cameron froze momentarily when he noticed me standing beside David. He parted his lips as if to speak, but Elena seized his arm. "Darling," she interjected with saccharine sweetness, "I'm feeling rather tired. Do accompany me to the seating area." Before leaving, she turned back to cast me a mocking glance. I paid her no mind. Being pregnant, I needed to keep my distance from such toxicity. The items at this auction were rather ordinary, so I wasn't particularly interested until I spotted a necklace. It was a stunning piece, one I'd long admired but never managed to acquire. The starting bid was $800,000. I was the first to raise my paddle. Elena wasn't going to back down either. She quickly followed suit with her own bids. 1 million. 1.5 million. Finally, Cameron raised his bid paddle. 3 million. He knew how long I had wanted that necklace. Yet he still went out of his way to outbid me, just to give it to Elena. I glanced in their direction and happened to catch Elena's smug expression. I knew that Elena didn't care about it. She just didn't want me to get it. 3 million, first time. 3 million, second time. I stopped raising my paddle. David squeezed my hand, as if wanting to increase the bid. 500. Before he could finish, I quickly pressed down on his hand. 5 what? Are you crazy? He looked slightly taken aback. 5 million isn't that expensive. Don't you want it? I scoffed. How is that not expensive? You've never been poor, have you? Only those who have truly experienced poverty understand how exorbitant 5 million really is. When driven to utter destitution, people would fight desperately for 500 yuan, let alone 5 million. But David, who'd never known true hardship, could never comprehend this reality. I shook my head. Stop bidding. I don't like losing money on things. The 3 million Cameron offered has already far exceeded the necklace's actual value. If he wants to be a sucker, let him. After all, Cameron had already signed the property division agreement. The money he was spending now came entirely from his own share. 3 million might seem insignificant, but every bit counts. I couldn't help but relish the thought of him squandering his wealth and sinking deeper into poverty. 3 million, third time. Sold. With the fall of the auction hammer, the dust settled. After the event concluded, the crowd filed out in an orderly procession. Elena deliberately walked up to me and began gloating. "Misty, are you upset? It's all Ayu's doing. The moment he saw I wanted it, he just had to get it for me. I could even let you take a look if you like." Cameron stood quietly beside her, silently watching the scene. He truly indulged Elena, letting her repeatedly flaunt herself in front of me. I curled my lips. "No need. It's not something I care for much. You can keep it. After all, what's so great about the things you go after?" I gave her a pointed glance at Cameron, who stood next to her. Cameron's face visibly darkened, and he snapped angrily, "Misty, how have you become like this? It's just a necklace. Does it really require such a sharp tongue? Fine, I'll get you another one later." I looked up at him in surprise, then stared at him for a long time. "No need. Like you said, it's just a necklace. I don't need it." Cameron was caught off guard for a moment, and then, as if remembering something, his expression softened. He finally realized I was a jewelry designer. When he first started his company, his first chunk of capital came from me selling the copyright to one of my designs, which earned him $1 million. Back then, He held me tightly, red-eyed, and promised me that he'd buy me all kinds of jewelry. But in the end, all he ever gave me was a plain, unremarkable ring. I was his girlfriend for 4 years, his wife for 3. With a small diamond, he took away the most precious 7 years of my life. Promises only mean something when they're spoken, and sincerity can change in the blink of an eye. In the end, love becomes a journey across mountains and rivers, sustained only by the integrity of hearts. Now, he had his company, and I had my own business. My jewelry design brand had become globally renowned. If I wanted something, I could buy it myself. I no longer needed him. Cameron seemed lost in memories for a moment, his gaze distant. When he looked at me again, there was a hint of guilt and longing in his eyes. At that moment, David's tall figure suddenly stepped in between us, blocking Cameron's gaze. His voice was languid, yet dripping with sarcasm. "Mr. Mao, it's been years. Changed your palate? Taken a liking to green tea these days?" When David said green tea, he casually shot Elena a glance. Elena forced herself not to explode, but the look on her face was contorted with anger. I couldn't be bothered to watch any longer. "David, let's go." Calling his name in public seemed to please David. He curved his lips into a smile. I thought it was all over, and that everything would calm down. But just then, Cameron suddenly had second thoughts. I have a habit of putting my phone on silent when I sleep. That day, when I woke up, I saw there were over 30 missed calls and more than 99 unread messages from Cameron. All of them were like this. "Misty, we need to talk. I'm coming to see you. There's no one home. Where are you? What did you go to the obstetrics and gynecology department for? Are you pregnant? If you are pregnant, I can promise not to separate. You're not responding. I'm waiting for you outside." Why didn't I respond? Because I had already moved out. The house where he and I had lived together, with all his traces of life in it, was too uncomfortable for me. I decided to sell it. When David found out, as the father of the child, he kindly offered me an island villa along with a private doctor and nurse. The island was beautiful, with great weather, perfect for pregnancy. I didn't refuse. Anyone who would refuse something like that would be a fool. Since David wanted to enjoy his rights as a father, he naturally had to pay the price. It was an equal exchange. David and I had gradually formed this kind of unspoken understanding. As for Cameron, according to our agreement, he still had quite a bit of property that hadn't been transferred to me yet. There was no way he could go back on that now. So, I immediately returned his call. Cameron's voice came through the receiver, tired and hoarse. "Misty," I asked the former servants. "They said they noticed you've been taking medication to support the pregnancy. If it's true, then we can still stay together?" I suddenly lost all patience. When things go wrong, even taking medicine can be secretly watched and reported by the servants. Thankfully, I knew better than to expect anything to stay secret forever. Not waiting for Cameron to finish, I calmly interrupted him. "I am pregnant." "But Cameron, who says the child is yours?" There was a long, long silence on the other end. I could almost hear Cameron's breath quickening. After a while, he finally coldly asked, "Misty, what do you mean by that?" When Cameron finally tracked me down, I was playing with Egg Yolk. Egg Yolk was the little yellow dog David had adopted for me out of concern that I might get bored. Gentle and affectionate, it loved nothing more than basking in the sun while curled up at my feet. When Cameron saw me, he froze. "You're really here," he said. "If I'm not mistaken, the property here should be under the Koo family name, right?" He stared at my belly as if trying to bore a hole through me with his gaze. "When exactly?" I tilted my head and smiled at him. "Do you remember my birthday?" I said. "The night you left midway to use a drone and confessed to Elena?" Cameron stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Finally, his voice quivering, he choked out, "Misty, we're not even separated yet and you've already cheated on me?" In his eyes, I appeared to be the one at fault, the betrayer who deserved condemnation. I couldn't help but laugh mockingly and retorted, "All these years, while you cycled through lovers like crops in a field, when you were rolling around with Elena and got her pregnant. Did you ever once think of me? He knew he was in the wrong but had no defense. Standing frozen for a long moment, he finally forced out the words reluctantly, "Misty, if you terminate the pregnancy, we'll stop this nonsense. I'll take you to the marriage registry, get married properly, and build a decent life together. Will that work?" I laughed in furious disbelief, my gaze locked unblinkingly with his. Terminate? Do you honestly think that's possible? I've suffered a miscarriage before. The doctors warned I might never conceive again. Have you forgotten why I lost that pregnancy in the first place? What gives you the right to decide my child's existence? His body swayed, and a flash of pain crossed his eyes. All right, then have the baby. When you're better later, we can have our own child. How about that? I felt like I was hearing the biggest joke in the world. I couldn't help but look at him like he was out of his mind. Do you want to hear yourself? Do you even know what you're saying? His eyes reddened as he made a final concession. Misty, for your sake, I'll claim this child as my own. At that moment, a low, derisive chuckle came from nearby. David had arrived. He loosened the top button of his shirt and, with a lazy tone, said, "Do you want my child to call you Dad? Mao, do you even deserve that?" The tension in the air grew thick and palpable. As soon as Cameron saw David, he seemed to be triggered and charged at him, his rage boiling over. "David, it's you." Unfortunately, he didn't get to lay hands on David as intended. The villa's bodyguards intercepted him mid-lunge, apparently having forgotten whose domain this truly was. His face red with fury, he struggled to break free from the guards, wanting to throw punches at David. But reality was cruel. One of the bodyguards casually pushed him aside, and he tumbled to the ground. David, on the other hand, remained seated on the couch, his legs crossed, looking at him with a cold, expressionless face, his demeanor like a wall of ice. "Do you want to leave on your own, or should I have someone throw you out?" I was a little surprised. David, though powerful and influential, had always been praised for his composure. Even when facing business rivals, I'd never seen him lose his temper or humiliate anyone before. This was the first time I saw him truly angry. Cameron, on his own, could do nothing. Though unwilling, it was futile. He looked defeated, finally managing to get up. Then he handed me a box. I didn't open it. The blue velvet box gave me a pretty good idea of what was inside. It was the necklace Elena had snatched away, the one I'd been longing for all this time. Cameron lowered his head and said, "Misty, at the auction, I didn't really want to steal the thing you liked. I just wanted to make you jealous, to get you to soften up for me. I got the necklace back for you. I'll have Elena get rid of the baby. You liked this necklace, didn't you? Let's make up, okay?" Yes. I once loved it so much. He knew full well, yet he helped Elena take it just to humiliate me. He also knew how heartbroken I was during every tearful argument we had, yet he continued to wound me relentlessly. I said calmly, "I don't like it anymore. Not the necklace. Not you." Cameron's face turned ashen. "Misty, stop pretending you don't care, all right? Do you really mean you can bear to part with me?" I found it laughable. In the past, he was the one who caused the most pain. How is it that now he's acting as if he is the victim? I looked at his reddened eyes, pulled the sleeve from his hand, and said with determination, "Cameron, you destroyed everything. If we're breaking up, let's do it completely. Don't ever make me look down on you again." 3 days later, Cameron and I completed the final property transfer at the notary office. Cameron looked exceptionally haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, clearly showing signs of sleepless nights. But honestly, whether he was doing well or not no longer mattered to me. The moment we parted ways, Cameron seemed to have something else he wanted to say. But before he could speak, Elena suddenly appeared. Her face was no longer the sweet, demure mask she usually wore. Instead, it was filled with anger and frustration. "Cameron, she's already carrying someone else's child. Why would you still give her so much? I thought you were just giving her a settlement payment. But how can you transfer that multi-million-dollar villa to her? Have you thought about me and the baby in my womb?" I raised an eyebrow slightly. Elena probably still didn't know that what Cameron gave me wasn't just a simple breakup settlement. Every business deal he made, every penny he earned included my share. Without me back then, how could he have achieved what he had today? I just got what I was owed. And Elena was far too hasty. Cameron was a man who loved passionately, but his affections were fleeting. She was showing off her loving wife persona too quickly, which wasn't a good sign. Misty, don't even think about taking advantage of this. Elena shouted and rushed at me in a frenzy. Enough, Cameron shouted, stopping her in her tracks. Are you done? Don't make a fool of yourself here. Elena stiffened at his shout, her eyes instantly welling up as she hurled her LV bag at him. I'm embarrassing you? How could you shout at me? You've already broken up with her, yet you still want to defend her? More and more people gathered around to watch. Cameron's expression grew increasingly irritated until he finally snapped. Even if I don't marry Misty, I would never marry you. Elena stood frozen, stunned by the outburst. Before she could process, she scrambled to catch up with Cameron, trying to grab his hand. But Cameron coldly pulled away, pushing her aside. Stay away from me. That's when the accident happened. Elena, always so concerned with her appearance, had never been cautious about her heels, even while pregnant. She wore her high heels like a badge of pride. But with Cameron's shove, she lost her footing, her heels slipping as she fell down the stairs. She hit the ground with a thud, clutching her stomach in pain, crying out, My baby. Cameron, it hurts. Cameron froze, his face draining of color as he rushed to her side. About 4 or 5 seconds later, blood began to flow from between Elena's legs. I felt my heart skip a beat, just like my own child once had. Was it fate? A philandering, faithless soul is destined for tenuous familial ties. Or perhaps the baby could sense, even from within the womb, that it wasn't truly loved by its father. And so it left. The world is beautiful, but sometimes it doesn't want to come back. After Elena's outburst, news of David and I eventually reached the Koo family. The next day, David's grandfather ordered him back to the family home, specifically requesting to see me. During the car ride, I couldn't help feeling uneasy. David reassured me that his grandfather was approachable and reasonable. I took his word for it. But the moment we walked in, the old man's face remained stern and unyielding. Though he was already 80 and needed a cane to walk, his demeanor commanded respect, and he had an air of authority about him. He squinted his eyes and said in an irrefutable tone, "Kneel." His commanding voice reverberated through the grand hall. Without a word, David took off his suit jacket and knelt down straight-backed. I followed, shivering in shock. Wait, does that mean I have to kneel too? I was confused. But when the old man saw me, his attitude shifted 180 degrees. He suddenly smiled warmly and walked over to me. Girl, don't be nervous, come sit down. Grandpa's not a bad guy. He then looked at David and continued, Grandpa just wants to teach this brat a lesson for bullying you. You sit on the sofa and watch. Still in shock, I was gently helped to sit down by the housekeeper. As our gazes met, David curved his lips slightly in reassurance, signaling me not to take offense. It seemed he was accustomed to kneeling like this. He should be able to manage it, but I overestimated him. The next moment he said, Grandpa, Misty's sitting now. Does that mean I can stop kneeling? The moment he spoke, Grandpa Koo exploded in fury. He immediately grabbed his cane and swung it at David's back. Brat, do you still have the guts to talk back? Have you forgotten the family rules? I introduced so many women to you, but you refused to meet any of them. And what did you do instead? You slept with a perfectly respectable girl. What a disgrace to our family. As he scolded, the old man's hits grew stronger. I was stunned by this scene. What era is this? How could they still be resorting to family discipline like this? David was a man of influence outside, yet when he came home, he had to kneel and take a beating. I tried to interject. Grandpa Koo, actually this wasn't David's fault. I was the one who drank first and initiated. Before I could finish, Grandpa Koo cut me off. Don't defend him. You were drunk, but what about him? If he hadn't harbored any improper intentions, would any of this have happened? Clearly, this brat took advantage of you. I'll teach him a proper lesson. The old man was serious, and the hits didn't stop. After a dozen or so strikes, traces of blood had begun to seep through David's white shirt. I hurriedly grabbed the cane and tried to stop him. Please, no more. Mr. Koo wouldn't back down and tried to wrestle the walking stick back from me. In the scuffle, David, who had been kneeling obediently, suddenly stood up and pulled me behind him. Grandpa, you can hit me, but don't push Misty. She's pregnant. At those words, Grandpa Koo's hand jerked to a halt midair. After a few seconds of confusion, his eyes lit up with excitement. Pregnant? Are you saying that I'm going to have a little great-grandchild? David paused, surprised. You mean to say you didn't know she was pregnant when you called me here to be punished? Grandpa Koo shook his head in puzzlement. It turned out he had only heard the gist of it and wasn't aware I was pregnant with David's child. I had come to the Koo residence fully prepared to discuss custody arrangements for the child. But when Grandpa heard everything, he immediately asked me when I was going to marry David. Grandpa, isn't that a little too quick to decide? I have to explain, I said apologetically. Grandpa Koo, I don't have plans to get married right now. When the old man heard that, he went quiet for a moment before glaring at David with a look of disappointment. You little brat, what have you been doing? You haven't even managed to win her over yet? When he said that, he didn't even try to spare my feelings. I awkwardly looked away. But then I heard David's voice, softly filled with a smile. Well, I guess I'm not too good at this. I'll try harder. That evening, Grandpa Koo arranged for us to stay at the old mansion. Deliberately claiming there weren't enough rooms, he settled David and me in the same bedroom. His matchmaking intentions were written all over his face. The room was decorated in a sleek black and white style, clearly David's personal space. David took off his blood-stained shirt and asked me to help him apply medicine to his wounds. His skin was so fair that the bruises and cuts stood out starkly. I carefully applied the ointment, my fingertips brushing over his skin. He was warm to the touch. David suddenly spoke in a hoarse voice. Grandpa's been eagerly hoping I'd get married. He's a little overenthusiastic, don't mind him. I gave a soft understanding that older people always want their children and grandchildren to settle down. After finishing the medicine, I took a deep breath and casually looked around the room. A pair of cufflinks on the dresser caught my eye. Why did they look so familiar? I walked over, picked them up, and was stunned. David, how come you have these cufflinks? David's gaze swept over the cufflinks before settling on my face. After several seconds of silence, he lowered his eyelids slightly. You gave these to me. I couldn't believe it. How could that be? I sold these cufflinks years ago. David took the cufflinks, took a deep breath as if bracing himself for something, and then began to explain. 8 years ago, a girl was selling these cufflinks at the university gate. These cufflinks are set with 6 blue and white diamonds, meticulously crafted with details that rival luxury haute couture pieces. Yet she sold them to me for just 800 yuan. She said she designed them herself, that they weren't from a famous brand, so they weren't worth much. She sold them to raise money to buy her boyfriend a new phone. Mid-sentence, David lifted his gaze with a self-deprecating smile. At the time, I thought she was quite beautiful, just a bit endearingly naive. During that period, I would often pass by that street and would frequently spot her setting up her stall to sell items. If she didn't have a boyfriend, I probably would have pursued her. But after she graduated, I went abroad, thinking I'd never see her again. But then, a few years later, her work unexpectedly surfaced at a global jewelry auction. And later, she found me with her own jewelry brand. Seeing her walk toward me brought back all those feelings. All these years, my conscience kept reminding me that her heart belonged to someone else, and I absolutely mustn't intrude. Until that night, when she suddenly came stumbling and fell right into my arms. Night enveloped everything. A warm amber glow suffused the room as the night breeze filtered through the gauzy curtains of the ancestral house, carrying a gentle chill with it. David's voice grew softer. That night, you kissed me first. Misty, how could I possibly let you go after that? I stood there in a daze, absorbing every word. David cupped my face in his hands and kissed me deeply. Later, I gave birth to an adorable, rosy-cheeked daughter. David had always been by my side, though I still hadn't agreed to his marriage proposal. There was no particular reason for it. It was simply because I didn't want to be trapped by another relationship. Only after experiencing confinement in a cage would you truly understand the value of freedom. Moreover, love and marriage are never the same thing. I no longer dared to enter into it so easily. My daughter was named Luna and took my surname. I watched Luna grow from babbling her first words to entering school. Before I knew it, 7 more years had passed. People often remarked that David had transformed from a young, handsome gay boss into what they now called the city's most eligible bachelor. David repeatedly clarified, "I'm not gay, nor am I single. I have a girlfriend. I have a daughter too. My daughter is beautiful." Grandfather Koo, still robust and healthy, would frequently chide him with exasperated sarcasm. "True, you've got a girlfriend and a daughter, but no wife. And your own daughter still calls you uncle." Luna, of course, had always known David was her father.
But she was so clingy to me.
Every time David came over, he'd insist on sleeping with me, clinging even more persistently than a child. So Luna would end up being coaxed away by Grandma. Luna would intentionally call him Uncle Koo. Uncle Koo would suffer from this injustice, and at night, he'd come looking for me with a pitiful look. He'd hug me and kiss me repeatedly, his tone full of grievance. "Misty, you heartless person. When will you finally make me your husband?" I lazily poked his abs as he held my waist. "Let's see how you behave tonight. And it depends on my mood tomorrow." David grumbled that all I ever gave him were empty promises. The next moment, he buried his head into my neck and kissed me more fiercely. Later, I heard from a friend that Cameron was dead. After Elena lost the baby, she clung to Cameron and refused to let go. She threatened to make Cameron marry her and take care of her for the rest of her life. Cameron had long been sick of her, so he naturally refused to comply and even tried to fire her from the company. In desperation, Elena abused her position to leak company secrets to competitors while secretly uncovering numerous financial discrepancies within the company. Cameron, overwhelmed, lost several big deals, and eventually his company went bankrupt. He hated Elena with all his might, and after a fierce argument, he lost control and pushed her down the stairs. Feeling like there was no way forward, with his heart deadened, Cameron followed her and jumped as well. When I heard this, I just casually responded, "Is that so?" There was no ripple in my heart. So many years had passed, hearing the name Cameron again felt as distant as a story from a past life. My friend sighed, "Do you remember how good you two were back in school?" I still remember how Cameron would bring you meals every day, tutor you, and couldn't go a single day without being by your side. Back then, the entire girls' dormitory knew how deeply he loved you. How could someone so wonderful end up ruined so quietly over time? I listened quietly, as though hearing a stranger's story. Mom, come play?" Not far away, my daughter was waving to me. David was playing frisbee with Luna and our dog. I quickly hung up, took the frisbee from Luna, and hurled it into the distance. The dog ran happily and Luna laughed joyfully. David gazed at me. That gaze, gentle and tender. All was serene and still. Cameron's perspective after we parted ways. Cameron secretly visited Misty 3 times. The first time was at the hospital. At the time, he was plagued by Elena's constant harassment, and his body had deteriorated severely from years of heavy smoking and drinking. When his stomach issues flared up, he landed himself in the hospital. In unbearable pain, Cameron would involuntarily recall Misty. After returning from drinking sessions, even the slightest furrow of his brow would trigger her concern for his well-being. Should he vomit, Misty's heartache would deepen immeasurably. He had always thought that someone who loved him so much like Misty would never leave him. But now, His stomach was bleeding, and the pain was unbearable. It was a luxury for him even to hear her voice. Misty had long since deleted him from her WeChat. Fortunately, the chat history was still there. He obsessively listened to the voice messages she had sent him in the past. "Honey, come pick me up after work, Mua. By the way, let's go to Iceland and see the aurora this year. Cameron, Mr. Mao. Happy birthday. Tonight you can't complain about the ugly cake I made." Her voice seemed so close yet so far, playful, sweet, angry. He deliberately ignored the voices of their later arguments, where she cried and asked whether he still loved her. After losing her, he finally understood. It wasn't that he had grown tired of Misty. It was that Misty had already become a part of him, like oxygen. He had taken her for granted, never realizing that he couldn't live without her. Later, by a twist of fate, he encountered Misty in the obstetrics and gynecology department of the same hospital. She was there for a prenatal checkup. David was with her the whole time, in a suit, attending to her every need. He was running around doing everything for the pregnant woman. At that moment, Cameron used all his strength to stop himself from rushing up to her, begging for her forgiveness. To avoid disturbing her, he fled in embarrassment. The second time he saw Misty was 3 years later. At that time, his company had run into trouble, and he was desperately looking for funding. He passed by Times Square and saw her jewelry advertisement on the big screen. She was a designer with both business acumen and artistic sensibility. In recent years, his career had stagnated, while hers had surged ahead, leaving him far behind in her wake. Cameron saw Misty in person beneath the advertisement, wearing a bright red dress, probably attending a commercial event. She was taking photos with reporters. She looked so breathtakingly beautiful. Yet there he stood, disheveled and haggard, forever trailing behind like someone who could never bridge the distance between them. Cameron silently wiped away tears. The third time he encountered Misty was at an amusement park. The sun was shining brightly. David was holding Luna with one hand, and with the other, he was holding an umbrella over Misty. The three of them were all wearing matching cute family outfits. Luna was laughing happily and first called David Uncle Koo. But as she continued, she abruptly changed her address and called him Daddy for some reason. David seemed stunned, asking Luna again, "Did you just say Daddy? Can you say it a few more times?" Quickly. The little girl was shy, but encouraged by Misty, she finally threw her arms around David joyfully. "I'm calling you Daddy now. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. What? Don't you want to be my daddy anymore? Would you rather stay as Uncle Koo?" David, for some reason, looked as if he was about to cry from joy. Meanwhile, Cameron was standing at an inconspicuous corner, watching jealously. By then, his company had already gone bankrupt. Elena, like a malignant tumor, plagued him relentlessly, making his life a living hell. He was so jealous of David for having Misty, and he regretted his choices even more. If he hadn't been swayed by temptation all those years ago, he would be the one holding Misty now. They would have children and wear matching family outfits. If only there were a time machine in this world. Then he could go back and undo all the hurt he caused Misty. She would still be his Misty. But unfortunately, all of this was just a delusion. Elena came to torment him again. This time, in their argument, she threw his old phone out of the window from the 15th floor. The phone shattered into pieces. Cameron completely lost his sanity. That phone contained the voice messages Misty had sent him over the years. He had never been able to bring himself to delete them. Every sleepless night, he would listen to them to soothe his broken heart. Yet now, Elena had destroyed it all. In that moment, his sanity completely collapsed. He pushed Elena over the edge. "Die," he said to her. He also said it to himself. As his body flew through the air, falling, the roaring wind rushed past his ears. "Misty, if I'm gone, will you ever think of me?" "Forget it. Just forget about me."